Democrats lost big in 2024. How can they make sure that doesn't happen again in 2026 and 2028? Simon Bazelon is the lead author of a new strategy document called Deciding to Win, and he joins the podcast today to discuss that topic: how Democrats can fix their problems and win elections in the coming years. We talk about the value of sticking to the issues where you're strongest. We talk about the value of moderation and how it helps Democrats win elections. And we talk about why Democrats have resisted these obvious ideas that you should moderate and talk about issues that you're popular on. Why has the Democratic Party been so bad at that in recent years? We discuss all this and more in today's episode. As always, thank you for listening. If you want to drop a like, a comment, recommend us to a friend, subscribe to the podcast, all of that is greatly appreciated. And a special thanks to everyone who supports the podcast on Patreon or as a CNL member. The best way to support the podcast is by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become a member. You can join a local chapter, get involved in your political community, in your local city, get cool benefits, bonus podcasts, swag that we mail to your doorstep. All these things can be yours for just a few dollars a month. Join at cnliberalism.org. Thank you for your support and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Simon Bazelon. Simon, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, so you are the lead author of Deciding to Win, which is a document that basically purports to have some advice for the Democratic Party. You are a Democrat. You want Democrats to win elections. And you and your co-authors have some ideas about how that should be done and why it hasn't worked in the past. Can you give me the elevator pitch? Obviously, this has been talked about a lot. There's been a lot of discourse about this. But for people who may not have heard about this or people who are not political junkies, who are not deep in the weeds on this stuff, why did you write Deciding to Win, and what does it say?
So we wrote Deciding to Win came out of a lot of my frustrations with the way the 2024 election went. I felt like in the aftermath of the 2024 election, there was a real lack of reckoning among Democrats about what went wrong. And so we were trying to do a sort of sober self-reflection about where our party has been, where we're going, and what we need to do in order to make sure that come 2026 and 2028, we're winning again. In terms of, elevator pitch, I think the report is really about two core ideas: prioritization and positioning. And when we're thinking about prioritization, we're thinking about what issues is the Democratic Party focused on. And when we're thinking about prioritization, we're thinking about what are the Democratic Party's positions on those issues. And when we're thinking about prioritization, you can tell a really clear story. In 2012, Democratic Party was overwhelmingly focused on economic issues. Barack Obama's campaign against Mitt Romney was centered on economic issues, the middle class, Medicare, Social Security. And then over the next 10 or 15 years, the Democratic Party sort of started to become less focused on economic issues. And there are a number of ways that you can demonstrate this. We looked at comparing the 2012 Democratic Party platform to the 2024 platform and saw sort of an explosion in the frequency of words like climate, guns, words related to race or identity or sexuality, words like equity or abortion. And at the same time, a sort of cratering of words related to the economy. And then as this change has happened, as Democrats have become less focused on the economy, the share of voters who say that the Democratic Party is out of touch has gone way, way up. And when you ask voters, what do you care about? And then when you ask them what they think the Democratic Party cares about, they overwhelmingly say that Democrats care too much about social issues, cultural issues, and not enough about those sort of concrete material economic issues. So that's the first half of the story. And then the second half of the story is this question of positioning, which is what are the Democratic Party's positions on these issues? And when we look at, for example, the share of Democrats in Congress who support various pieces of progressive legislation, what we see is that the Democratic Party has become significantly more left-wing on essentially every single issue since Barack Obama was reelected. For example, in 2013, 24% of congressional Democrats co-sponsored Medicare for All. Today, that's double. It's 47%. 1% of Democrats in Congress co-sponsored a reparations study bill. Now 57% co-sponsored that bill today. And you see this for all kinds of progressive legislation. Assault weapons ban, 40% to 90%. And then as that change has happened, again, voters have noticed it. So the share of voters who say that Democrats are too liberal has gone up substantially as Democrats have shifted left from about 46% to about 55%. And Democrats have had big losses among moderate and conservative voters. So I think that's kind of the basic picture of the story we're telling, right? We're telling a story about a party that is less focused on economic issues, that is more left-wing across the board, a party that voters do not think is focused enough on economic issues, a party that voters think is too left-wing. And then as both of those shifts have happened, declines in support among working class, moderate, conservative, Latino, Black voters like that.
Now, one of the things that the report doesn't talk about all that much is the transformation of the Republican Party, mostly because that's not the point of the report, right? But I do find it interesting that, the Democratic Party has certainly changed from the 90s to the 2000s to now. A very different party, significantly more left-wing, as you said, on a number of positions. The Republican Party has changed a lot, though, as well. The Republican Party seems to have gotten under Donald Trump a lot more nativist, a lot more, anti-immigrant. What's your working theory on why they are able to kind of win despite their perception that, because voters do think that, MAGA candidates, for instance, in the Republican Party are, kind of less electable than moderate Republicans, but that hasn't stopped them from winning, trifectas in both Trump terms. So are Democrats just punished more harshly for this? Is this a particular condition of the party? Is this something structural? What do you think?
It's a combination of things. I think the most important thing to understand is that while Republicans have become more extreme on some issues, right? Personal, the rule of law, personal corruption by Donald Trump, rhetoric related to transgender people, they've become much more extreme on some things relative to 2012. They've also become more moderate on a number of issues. For example, Donald Trump successfully won battles in the Republican Party to completely defeat efforts to cut Medicare and Social Security, which were two big issues that Democrats had campaigned against Republicans on for many, many years. Similarly, Trump has taken office and done absolutely nothing to try to restrict abortion rights at the national level, which is a big difference from 2012 when the Republican Party platform called for an amendment to the U.S. Constitution to give fetuses the same rights as humans.
Yeah, this is something I reference sometimes on the podcast where I think it gets lost, but I remember the 2016 Republican debate where they basically went around and said, would you, do we need to reform / cut Social Security? And basically every candidate raised their hand except for Donald Trump, who said, no, I love Social Security. Your Social Security is going to be safe with me. We're never cutting it, blah, 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 blah. I think he was the only candidate in the Republican primary to say that.
Yeah, and I think this is a huge part of the story of how Trump took over the Republican Party. If you go back to 2013, there were basically two issues where Republican elites were dramatically out of step with Republican primary voters. And those two issues were immigration and entitlement reform, where Republican primary voters mostly did not really want entitlements to be cut, and they really, really did not want comprehensive immigration reform. And at the time, Republican leaders in Congress were pushing hard on both of those fronts. And so I don't think it's that surprising that Donald Trump was able to kind of take over the party on a platform that rejected both of those prevailing wisdoms. Look, I think the other thing that's important to say is that despite Trump, this kind of two-step of being more extreme on some, issues like rhetoric and authoritarianism and whatnot, while also being more moderate on these economic issues, that has combined to convince, or, for a long time, before Trump was elected, for example, more voters thought that Kamala Harris was too liberal than thought that Donald Trump was too conservative, right? during the 2024 election. And I think that is to say that Republicans are absolutely punished for their extremism. We see very clearly that MAGA candidates do worse electorally than more moderate Republicans. But voters think that Democrats are more extreme than Republicans. So when they're punishing extremism, they're punishing the Democratic Party more than the Republican Party because they see the Democratic Party as even more out of step with their views and their priorities.
Again, another data point that I like to say sometimes is that in the exit polls, I think for 2016, more voters said that like Hillary Clinton was further left, than said that Donald Trump was too far right.
Yes.
Donald Trump was perceived by the voting body, only narrowly, only by a point or two, but this would still shock people, I think, that Donald Trump was perceived by the voting public as more moderate.
Well, and so what's interesting also is that, if you look at Gallup's data from October, right before the 2016 election, the share of voters who said that Donald Trump was too conservative was actually lower than the share of voters who had said Mitt Romney was too conservative in 2012. I think that really would confuse a lot of Democrats, but, the voters really care about these economic issues, and Trump really did moderate the Republican Party's position a lot.
Yeah. So I want to try to ask some tough questions here because
let's do it.
Frankly, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I am naturally inclined to agree with a lot of this report. We're going to link the report, which is, again, called Deciding to Win. We're going to put that in the show notes.
You can just go to decidingtowin.org. Nice and simple.
Decidingtowin.org. You can go there directly. You can click on it in the show notes. I encourage everybody to read it. It's very readable. It's got lots of good graphs and data. So I enjoyed reading it. I'm glad you guys put it out there. I'm going to try not to just agree with you the entire time here. And push a little bit if I can. But there has been an enormous amount of discourse around this and around what it means to moderate, which you have an opinion on, about how effective that kind of thing is, about the role of messaging. One of the ideas that I've seen people kind of batting around is what I'll call the Kilmar-Abrego-Garcia problem. And that, is something where, look, immigration is a weak point for Democrats, and Donald Trump is obviously a nativist and wants to deport a bunch of people, and is currently doing things that are pretty unpopular with the general public. He's deporting people. There's videos every single day, it seems like, of ICE tackling U.S. citizens to the ground, and basically the Kilmar problem says, look, they're doing things that are deeply unpopular and horrifying. Why shouldn't we talk about it? Why shouldn't we, hammer that this thing that he's doing that is going to be unpopular in the long run? And some people even point to, look, when you talk about this stuff, Donald Trump gets less popular on immigration. Shouldn't we highlight all the terrible things he's doing, rather than running away from it?
I appreciate this question. I think it's a really important issue, and I'm going to try to give it a nuanced answer. I think what a lot of people have trouble with in Democratic politics sometimes is just this question of trade-offs. And particularly when it comes to issue prioritization, there are a lot of important trade-offs where you can talk about multiple issues. Absolutely, you can. But you can't talk about multiple issues in the exact same sentence, right? Like every word you say about one issue is a word that you're not saying about another issue. There's just a finite number of things you can say in politics, right? And so, when we asked voters what issues they prioritize, and then when we compared that to what issues they thought Democrats prioritize, the number one issue that they thought Democrats prioritized too much was protecting the rights of undocumented immigrants. And I'm not saying that's not an important issue, or that Democrats, shouldn't stand up for undocumented immigrants when their rights are being trampled on by the Trump administration. Particularly, people, obviously the Kilmar-Abrego-Garcia case, very terrible to have somebody deported to, CCOT unlawfully. I think it's important to understand that we need to be focused on the issues that voters want us to be focused on. I think that's sort of a basic task of a political party. And at the margin, we want to be fighting the political war on the issues that are strongest for us: healthcare, the cost of living, Trump's tariffs, things like that. And so I don't think the Democrats need to cave on all the issues that are, Trump's, where he's stronger on. On a lot of those issues that he's stronger on, he's still below water on those issues. But when we're talking about what we want to drive attention to, our goal ought to be to drive attention to the issues where voters trust us more, where our position is more popular than Republicans by the biggest amount possible.
One thing I think about with this, and I think this can cut both ways, is gay marriage, where if I'm imagining the Democratic Party in 2004, 2006, and they've lost some elections, they're feeling bad. I guess 2006 was actually pretty good, but 2004 they lost in 2000. The midterms in 2002 didn't go well for them. 2004 they lose again, and I'm imagining a deciding to win that comes out in 2004 that says, look, Democrats are weirdos who want gay people to get married. The public doesn't approve of this. You need to shut up and stop talking about it. Maybe you can try to help gay people a little bit on the margin, once you're in power, but like nobody should be talking about this. It's bad for Democrats. But the thing is that over time, it did become more socially accepted because people put in the work, because of gay rights activists and because of the Democratic Party. And, over the course of a decade or two, gay marriage went from something that Republicans would hammer Democrats on to the reverse. Democrats could use it as a cudgel against Republicans. Now, I'm not sure that applies to every issue. Abortion famously is kind of stuck in the same zone for like 50 years. It's not appreciably different, I think, maybe in the last year or two, actually, with the Supreme Court ruling. But abortion for decades just didn't move at all. So I'm not sure that happens with every issue. But what do you think about that argument that, well, like, in order to move the percentages, we actually have to talk about certain things?
Yeah, so I think this is a view that a lot of people hold, that the Democratic Party ought to be sort of the vanguard of public opinion. I think when you look at history, it's really hard to make the argument that this is something that actually works or happens. So let's take the example of gay marriage. What actually happened with gay marriage? Well, in 2008, we nominated a Democratic candidate in Barack Obama, who said that he believed that marriage was between a man and a woman. And then he appointed Supreme Court justices who overturned bans on gay marriage. But he wasn't the vanguard of public opinion on that issue, right? He was a lagging indicator. And so I think there's this question, which is, in a democracy, there is absolutely a huge role for people who want to change public opinion, who want to get public opinion to be more favorable to their views and their issues. And that's great. That's absolutely a core part of democracy. The question is, should our elected officials be the leading edge of efforts to shape public opinion? And my view is that the role of the elected official is really to represent the country, not to tell voters that the views they hold are wrong. And that's not to say, I don't know, I'm going to say that's 100% of the time, but it's really hard to come up with examples of where national political figures were leading indicators on an issue. And that led to, sustained public opinion change. Much more frequently, what we see is that when national political figures adopt an issue, they motivate, a small subset of the population, the most hardcore partisans. They get those people to change their minds, but those swing voters in the middle actually become less favorable to the issue. So take an issue like tariffs, right? Donald Trump, since Donald Trump was inaugurated, Republican voters have become more skeptical of free trade. Democrats have become much more favorable of free trade. And then the question is, well, what about those swing voters, those independent voters? Well, independent voters have also become more favorable to free trade. They've moved in the same direction as Democrats. And I think that's a good example that while a national political figure might have control over parts of his own base, he doesn't control those moderate voters in the middle. And in fact, the more that he endorses an issue that's unpopular, the more unpopular it's going to become with those voters. So I think that kind of model of public opinion change that you're presenting as a thought experiment, I don't think that really maps on to how public opinion actually changes in the real world.
When we think about which issues to prioritize, obviously, it's not new advice to, hammer the economy, hammer healthcare. You can go back to Bill Clinton, in the 90s saying it's the economy stupid. I think that was Clinton, or was that? I feel like I may be misremembering that now. That may have been someone else, but the advice to focus on jobs and the economy is old. Democrats have been hammering healthcare for a long time, and frankly, I think the Republican Party got very lucky that John McCain helped them not overturn and repeal the Affordable Care Act.
Absolutely.
They would have faced a much bigger backlash if they had done that.
Absolutely.
They kind of dodged a bullet there. But when we think about this, all these kind of issue prioritization things, I guess I don't disagree with you that we should focus on those things. We should talk about what the voters care about most and areas where we have an advantage. Those are good things to focus on. But you obviously can't focus on those things 100% of the time. There's an entire conservative media ecosystem that's going to try to focus the conversation on things, that Democrats are weak on. And you're going to have a response on those. So what do you think about, like, how do you address the weak areas, even when, you don't want to spend 100% of your time talking about trans people or illegal immigrants or whatever? If you're a Democrat, that's probably losing ground these times, but you've got to have something to say. So if you're the comms advisor for a major presidential campaign here, how do you advise them to deal with this? What do you want them to say? How often do you want them to say it? Like, what's your strategy here?
I think the most important thing to understand is that salience is directly related to the positions that you take. The more unpopular positions that you stake out on an issue, the more salient that issue is likely to be in an election, because your opponent is going to be able to raise it and raise it more successfully. So, for example, think about, I always try to present things in terms of Republicans because I think Democrats often have an easier time thinking about it when thinking about Republicans. Would Kamala Harris, hypothetically, imagine if Donald Trump had said that if he took office in 2024 during the election, imagine if he had said that he was going to try to ban abortion nationally with no exceptions. My guess is that Kamala Harris would have had a much more productive, successful time at making abortion a central issue of the campaign if Trump had come out and said that. And that's because Trump would have he would have been staking out a much more extreme, much more unpopular position than the one he actually campaigned on, which was that he would veto any federal abortion ban. And so similarly, I think when you think about something like trans athletes, I think one reason that Democrats, that this issue gets talked about a lot is that the Democratic Party has staked out a really unpopular position on the issue. And if Democrats just took the more popular position on the issue that 70% of the country, and even, in a lot of polls, a majority of Democrats support, then it would be a lot harder for Republicans to make the issue, to get attention to the issue. I think a good example of this is somebody I think a lot about is Janelle Stelson. And she was a Democratic candidate in the Pennsylvania 10th district, which was a district that Donald Trump won by about 5%. And she lost very narrowly against a Republican incumbent, but it was a very impressive result, sort of from an overperformance perspective. And coming out of her debate against Scott Perry, her opponent, the headline in the local newspaper was, "In Pennsylvania 10th debate, Stelson and Perry agree on immigration, differ on abortion." And that article spent a bunch of time discussing their difference of opinion on abortion. And the reason that she got that headline, which is a great headline for Democrats, is that during the debate, she emphasized that she wants to deport more violent criminals and secure the border and things like that. And so if you want to focus the conversation on the issues that are best for you, the easiest way to do that is by limiting your weaknesses on the issues that you don't want talked about. And the easiest way to do that is to have positions that voters agree with on those issues.
Now, a lot of this, we can talk about it in these very high-minded terms. We can use a lot of political science terms and get into the details here, get very wonky. To some degree, though, this is very basic advice, right? It's talk about the issues that voters trust you on, and take popular positions.
And take positions that they agree with on the issues that they don't trust you on.
So take popular positions and then talk about the things you're strong on. This is groundbreaking political advice that I make fun of it very slightly, but only to highlight that, well, I guess it did need to be said because it's not what the Democrats were doing. And that raises an obvious question, which is, why were they not doing this? So, like, are they stupid? Is the Democratic Party run by very stupid people? Is it an ideological capture thing? Is it something about the role of the way the institutions are set up? Why overall does the Democratic Party seem to have such a hard time with the basic ideas of talk more about popular things and take popular positions?
So I think that there are basically two problems here. One is an incentives problem, and one is an epistemics problem. So, I'll talk about the epistemics problem first. I think it's underrated the extent to which a lot of disagreements about tactics within the Democratic Party are driven by disagreements between, political operatives and elites and staffers and elected officials themselves about empirical questions that actually we have pretty good answers to. So things like, does moving left increase your turnout so that you do better electorally? Right? We have an answer to that question. The answer is no. It's pretty conclusively demonstrated by a huge amount of evidence. But there are a lot of people in democratic politics who believe, something false with respect to that question. Similarly, there's been a lot of effort by political scientists to look at issue polling, and they find that issue polling, sort of for predictable reasons, systematically overstates the popularity of changes to the status quo in policy terms. But a lot of people, that information hasn't made its way to everybody in the party. And a lot of people continue to sort of tout issue polling that's done in this flawed methodology to say that every single one of their ideas, from student loan cancellation to banning plastic straws, that all of these ideas are actually super popular. When we do more rigorous ways of looking at this, or when we look at what candidates who actually run in tough races do, we can see that these are not actually popular issues. So that's kind of the epistemics problem. Is there's just been a lot of, honestly, misinformation on the progressive side of things about where the American people stand on a number of public policy questions. And that has, for a lot of people who want the Democratic Party to hew closer to public opinion, if you have a misunderstanding of where public opinion actually is, then you're going to make a lot of mistakes as a result.
Do you think this is kind of look, the progressive left wing of the party wants certain things to be true, and so they're kind of willing to believe sketchy information or bad studies or bad surveys that say that it's true? It's a confirmation bias thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of confirmation bias. This is inevitable, right? Everybody looks for information that confirms what they want the world to be like. And I don't think that's unique to the progressive left. Everybody does this. But I do think it's a particularly acute problem within the Democratic Party. And it's rather unfortunate. And it puts us in a lot of, tough binds where we just have a lot of people in positions of power who believe things about electoral politics that are factually inaccurate. And that, makes decision making pretty tricky. For a good example I like to use, people say all the time that climate change is a motivating issue for young voters. In our polling, we found that, among 18 to 29-year-old voters, climate change was roughly, ranked around the 25th most important issue to those voters. And so that's just an example of a thing that a lot of Democrats believe that isn't true, which is that,
hey, top 25. Look, if you're top 25 in college football, that's pretty good, right? That means you're a pretty good team.
Right, exactly. So I think there's this epistemics problem. The other problem is just this incentives problem. And this kind of follows from some of the epistemic questions, but it's a bit distinct from it, which is just that the sincere preferences of basically everybody who is powerful in democratic politics, from the staffers to the donors, to the advocacy groups, to the elected officials themselves, to the big donors and the small donors, all of these people are much more left-wing and care much less about economic issues, bread and butter issues like crime and border security, than the average voter does. And so it's only natural that these people are going to exert a disproportionate influence over the party. And the way they exert this influence is by moving the party away from public opinion. And so I think that kind of gets at why Democrats are in the position they're in, and why, some of the, as you said, look, none of the things in deciding to win are particularly groundbreaking. Frankly, a lot of it at the high level isn't even that interesting, right? Talk about popular issues and talk about the issues that voters care about most. That's nothing. That's not advice. That's just obvious, right? To some extent. But I do think that it rings as surprising to a lot of people because of some of these, epistemic and incentive-based problems.
The second one there, I think, is interesting about, I don't disagree that, the staffer class is wildly left-wing, even compared to Democratic primary voters. Not just Democratic voters, in the universe we're talking about, there's the median voter, swing voter, then there's the Democratic voter, then there's the Democratic primary voter, and then even further to the left of that is the Democratic staffer class and the nonprofit class. And you can lump academia and the media in there too, the kind of progressive Borg, the purple blob, some people call it. Um, but like all of those people are significantly further left. But it doesn't strike me that that automatically means that Democrats are going to have bad strategy. Like you'd think that these people who want to achieve very left goals would be hyper focused on electing Democrats, that, they would recognize, well, if I want to get my laundry list of progressive policies, then I have to get a bunch of Democrats elected. So I'm going to focus on electability. And yet that doesn't happen.
Well, that's where I think the epistemic problem comes in. When I talk to people on the left of the political spectrum who work in professional democratic politics, I think overwhelmingly these are people who sincerely believe that a more progressive politics is also a more electable politics. That if Democrats are, more, if they fight more, if they campaign on Medicare for all and abolishing ICE, these are people who, they want to help the country. They want the country to do well. And they believe that the best way to do that is for the Democratic Party to have a bold progressive agenda, and that's going to inspire people to vote. And unfortunately, on some of these issues, even where I agree with them on the merits of these issues, I think, there are a lot of misunderstandings about where public opinion is. And so I think that's why, even people who care a lot about electability often, make tactical errors.
I think that's part of it. I would also throw a couple other things in there in terms of incentives that you face when you're inside the party. There's a lot of safe seats these days. Most people in Congress, in both parties, are running in safe seats where they have to worry much more about a primary challenge than they do about losing in a general election. And so the incentive becomes not to moderate. The incentive becomes, well, I don't want anyone to be more progressive than me, further left than me, and beat me in a primary. And therefore, my incentive is not to moderate. Even if that would help the national party, I'm in a safe seat. Yeah, I think as far as congressional Democrats go, that's a big factor. And the fact that, again, we've gerrymandered more and more and more so that there's fewer and fewer, just competitive seats. I also think about incentives in terms of just the general progressive infrastructure in and of itself. Like, have you ever heard of the iron law of institutions?
No.
Iron law of institutions is something I love. And once you learn about it, you will see it everywhere. Basically says that people within a large institution care more about advancing within the institution than they care about the mission of the institution itself. That, if you're a mid-level person somewhere in the Democratic hierarchy, you care more about moving up in the hierarchy than you do about actually helping Democrats win. And you can apply this to corporations, political parties, militaries, whatever, that the incentive is always to advance yourself. And, does this actually help the organization? Who knows? And I think that inside the Democratic apparatus, you're never punished for going too progressive. You can be punished for being moderate. And again, it produces weird incentives.
Yes. I mean, I think that's right. I think, there are a lot of strange professional incentives for people in Democratic politics. And I think the safe seats for swing seats thing, really matters. I think it's very important to understand that for the overwhelming majority of elected Democratic officials in the United States, their biggest threat to their continued job security is a challenge from another Democrat, not from another Republican. And when we look at that subset of Democrats whose biggest threat is a challenge from a Republican, those people act dramatically differently. When we look at, one thing that we looked at was among incumbent House members in the Democratic caucus who won in districts in 2024 that Donald Trump won, how they differed on the issues from incumbent House Democrats who won in districts that Kamala Harris won. And the answer is that they differ dramatically. Half of the Democrats who won in Trump districts were co-sponsors on a voter ID bill. 0% of Democrats in districts that Kamala Harris won were co-sponsors on, a voter ID bill. And you see this across the board, where just these huge gaps between support for Medicare for all and the Green New Deal and, Laken Riley, an immigration restriction bill, just all across the board, these big differences in issue positionings between Democrats who actually face competitive general elections and Democrats who don't. So I absolutely think that plays a key role.
Now, I think one of the things that's important to talk about here is that when you recommend moderating in this document, that doesn't necessarily mean, taking, the quote unquote moderate position on every issue. That there are things that progressives fight for that are actually very popular. That there are things like expanding healthcare coverage in various ways. Medicare for all itself, I don't think, is actually superbly popular, but there are a lot of ways expanding Medicare, expanding Obamacare can be very popular. $15 minimum wage can be popular. There are kind of progressive and moderate policy choices that poll very well. Similarly to the way that on the Republican side, there are some Republican policy choices that seem to poll well and some that don't. But when thinking about this, one of the things I worry about when we chase popular policy is that if you just look at a list of what people say they like, you can trap yourself into really bad outcomes. For instance, I think before Trump started his tariff war, that, if you had polled people and said, hey, we should put a tariff that will, prioritize American manufacturers over foreign ones, it probably would have polled very well. And there's a history of that kind of thing polling well. Once you actually do it, it turns out to be a disaster and people start hating it. There's also like there was a poll recently, and I wish I knew who did this, but I totally believe the poll where they basically polled the idea of price controls. The affordability crisis is a big thing. Everybody seems to agree Democrats should talk about it. And this person said, hey, price controls seem to be really popular among voters, both Democratic, Independent, and Republican voters. And yet, because I have an econ background, my instinct is screaming at me, if you actually promise price controls and then you implement them, it's going to backfire on you super hard. It's actually going to end up being a disaster, and you're going to get kicked out of office, and it'll just be terrible in the end. So I guess what allowances in your mental model here of how this works, what allowances do you have for, we have to choose things that are popular, but we also have to make sure they're not stupid?
Look, I think that's a pretty important thing. If your policies sound good, but they don't work, that's going to backfire on you very likely. I'm not an economist, nor am I, an expert on price controls or whatnot. But, I think the criticism of price controls that if you did price controls, then you'd get shortages and people wouldn't like that. If you did get shortages, then I think you'd have a political problem. And I think, one thing that we see very clearly in the data is that the state of the economy matters tremendously for whether or not incumbent presidents get reelected or which party wins the election. It explains about 40% of historical election outcomes over the last, 50 or 60 years, just the state of the economy. And so it's really important if you're the incumbent president, if you're the incumbent party, to make the economy go well. And that means, not necessarily, it might not mean always hewing to public opinion, right? If voters say they want huge tax cuts for people making less than $100,000, but you do big tax cuts and then that causes lots of inflation, they might not like the resulting inflation. And so that might not actually be a good policy to adopt politically. And so I think there absolutely is an important distinction here, which is you don't necessarily, particularly on economic issues, but also on all issues, it's very important to have policies that are not just popular with the electorate, but that actually work.
Yeah, I think there's generally no way to, to cheat the system there. That number one, just one of the strongest forces in politics right now is just the bounce back effect, right? Thermostatic politics. When you try to do things, they're going to be unpopular and voters are going to punish you. Voters are always going to be unhappy with people who are in power. Thermostatic backlash is very strong right now. We're seeing it with Trump, who's already his popularity is already as low as it ever was in his second term, I believe. But also, that you can't just, I don't know, you got to pay the piper at some point. That I think about like the inflation example, that the Biden team went really big on extra rounds of stimulus spending and giant bills that were deficit, adding to the deficit. And they just figured, well, in 2008, we didn't go big enough. And so we should go super, super, super big. And they discounted fears of inflation, but like you always have to pay the piper. The inflation showed up and people punished them for it, and that kind of thing happens. But let me pivot here for a second because we've got just a little bit of time left. When you released this caused a big firestorm on social media. I imagine you were pretty happy with the firestorm because it means people were talking about it. They were discussing it a lot, both people who thought it was a good idea and a bad idea. And firestorm can be, stressful, but it's better than nobody reading it at all, right? So
100%.
I want to ask about your reaction to like, did it surprise you how much people argued and how vociferously they argued about this? And I guess also, I've kind of been testing out a few different like critiques of the paper. Were there any that you thought would, because you got, I'm sure, hundreds of critiques, some of them just probably calling you names, just calling you an asshole. But were there any that actually stood out to you as like, well, that's a pretty good point. We should have maybe addressed that. Or is there anything that you think was a particularly strong critique?
I think, frankly, the critiques that we got were overwhelmingly non-substantive. I think, there were very, very few people who raised any actually substantive issues with respect to it. Now, to be clear, I don't think that means that our report was perfect. I have things that when I think about it, I think are reasonable criticisms. I think that, we could have done a better job talking about, there are a couple areas of public policy that we didn't quite get into as much. Guns, education, some foreign policy questions. I think that, we could have done a better job talking about the way that earned media works and how positions taken flow through to voters and things like that. So I think that there are reasonable critiques. What I will say is that I think that the critics overwhelmingly did not raise the substantive reasonable critiques and overwhelmingly focused on, sort of ad hominem.
You think that most people process this not through a strategic lens, but through like a tribal lens?
I think most of the people criticizing it, for sure. When I looked at the replies to my tweets, basically nobody was trying to raise substantive objections, even to things where I think, again, there might be reasonable substantive objections. I don't mean to say that the fact that people weren't doing that means that it's above criticism or anything. Now, the other thing I will say is that the one thing that I was most pleasantly surprised by was a really positive reception from a lot of people within the Democratic Party who I don't perceive as, having been super aggressively pushing a kind of moderation approach. And so I was pleased that we got, support from a lot of folks who I don't necessarily always consider to be in this camp. That was good.
What's your perception of how deeply has this penetrated the actual party establishment, the congressional offices, the DNC, senatorial offices, campaigns? Because obviously, like, look, you pretty much have the CNL type of person on your side, the new liberals, the Matt Iglesiases of the world, that group, I think, was very naturally predisposed to believe this sort of thing anyway. And like, for me, part of this is very odd. There are parts where I want the party to moderate. There are parts where I'm unhappy that they have to moderate, but I believe it's probably necessary anyway. Like I'm a huge immigration guy. I believe in immigration so strongly, and it just fucking bums me out that immigration is so unpopular. But I'm trying not to stick my head in the sand about that.
Yeah, the report it's not all good news for the neolibs,
You've got natural allies who believe in this stuff, but what's your sense of like, is this actually penetrating the party apparatus? Are campaigns taking this into account? Or do you think that the party apparatus is dismissing it?
I think that it has penetrated the party apparatus to a large extent intellectually. I think, it remains to be seen how much that turns into actual action and different decision making. My current feeling is that it's, mostly unlikely to produce huge changes, primarily because the incentive structure hasn't changed. And so convincing people of good ideas on the merits doesn't necessarily matter if their incentives are the same as they've always been. And so I think, the people who are taking it most seriously are the swing district Democrats or people who are trying to unseat Republicans in the 2026 elections, who, a number of whom have reached out to me and asked me for my thoughts on what they can do to win those races. I've been really, heartened by the fact that those people who are in the most difficult position, trying to win the hardest races, that they take it seriously. I think that's, or something I appreciate as a real vote of confidence. But I think, safe seat Democrats are still facing the same incentives as they always have. And so I think it's somewhat unlikely that deciding to win produces a big change in the behavior of those people.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll see. And it's a campaign document, I would say, more than it is a governing document. It doesn't have as much to say. It has something to say, I think, about how you actually govern, but it is more a how do you win elections kind of document rather than what should you prioritize once you're in government. But it'll be interesting to see. I think clearly in 2026, there's widespread agreement that, okay, Democrats should focus on affordability and healthcare. And that's not just because of you guys, but you guys at least played a part in that being so widely agreed. I think there's much less widespread agreement on the moderation on social issues, kind of part of this,
Yeah.
moderation on LGBT issues or immigration or something like that. That is within party circles much more controversial, I think.
Absolutely. I think that's right. I think, a lot of people are coming together around an affordability message. And I think that's great in a lot of ways. But I also think it's really important to understand that just talking about affordability all the time isn't going to prevent us from being attacked if we continue to have unpopular positions on issues like immigration or crime or energy production or cultural issues.
All right. So we're coming up on time. I want to ask the traditional final question that I love to ask on this podcast, and that is, where can listeners go to learn more?
Yeah.
If they're interested. And I will be the first one to say, look, first of all, you should just go read Deciding to Win. It's at decidingtowin.org. It's in the show notes. You can click it there. Go do that first. I'm happy to recommend your work. But what else do you read when you try to understand the things we're talking about here? This could be books, blogs, particular personalities, articles, anything that you think is helpful for people who are just interested in what we're talking about and want to learn more about it.
Yeah, so I'll give a couple examples. So first, decidingtowin.org. One thing I'll say is there's a lot of stuff in the report itself. If you go to the bottom of that website, you can also find a number of written appendices that add a huge amount of color to stuff that we didn't want to put in the main text of the report, but that I think is still useful information. In terms of, you can also follow me on Twitter at Simon_Bazelon. That's where I post, a lot of my work. In terms of learning more about this stuff, I think that the number one thing you can do to get a better grasp of how Democrats can win elections more is by watching campaign ads from Democrats who actually win in Trump districts. So to everybody out here, I would just really recommend go on YouTube, search up, Jared Golden ads, search up Mary Peltola ads, search up Ruben Gallego ads, and spend, 15, 20 minutes looking at what these candidates are campaigning on, what they're talking about, what positions they're taking. I think that's the thing that will give you the absolute best sense of what Democrats can do to win elections.
Excellent. Well, look, we all want Democrats to win more elections. Hopefully this can help them do it. I want to say thank you for coming on the podcast one more time. Simon Bazelon, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.